Hello and welcome to Three Methods for Defending Your Scientific Analyses. This is a professional development course short video series for Transcend. So, what are these methods to defend your scientific analyses? Well, first is to develop perspective clarity on your analysis plan. Second is to plan for multiple sensible approaches for comparison. And third, be your toughest critic. So let's dive into each of these specifically. First up is that clarity part of it. So you want to be clear about what you're actually doing, especially ahead of time. So you want to write out your hypotheses plainly. You want to be able to clearly know what questions you're trying to answer and what you think the results are so that it's not in the fog in the dust of like what you're actually trying to achieve. With that, you should also detail out your statistical analyses. Like, how are you going to test your hypotheses? How are you going to try to answer the scientific question you have? And that's going to force you to think about the variables you'll use, about what sort of statistical assumptions you'll need to check for, etc. And yeah, leading right into that, you're going to need to check all those model assumptions. If you're running a t-test, regression, ANOVA, etc., they all have certain assumptions. You need to check them, make sure you meet the assumptions. If not, you need to do a different test, whether it's parametric versus non-parametric or switching from a more rigid sort of typical linear regression to a more flexible model like a generalized linear model or a mixed model. Making sure you know that your model, your statistical assumptions are met. And then finally, in that clarity bucket here is you need to plot, and plot some more. You need to really clearly understand your data, understand what's going on, whether or not you ultimately use these plots and polish them for a publication. You need to be able to visualize your data in as many ways as possible to understand what's going on so that what you're trying to answer and what you think your statistical models are telling you are in fact reality. And so plotting it, visualizing your data is one of the best ways to have clarity about what your results show. All right, sort of on the flip side of this, on the inverse of things that do not allow for clarity, things that you shouldn't do if you want to be clear. So first of all is what I call post hoc explanations. That's where you kind of go into it. You don't really clearly define your hypothesis or even maybe your statistical methods. You just fumble around, come up with something interesting in the end, and then sort of explain it post hoc after the fact. That is not good for clarity. That's not good for scientific integrity. It's not good for defending your analyses if you sort of make things up after the fact. You should have things clearly in place of like what you mean to do and how you mean to do it ahead of time. Similar on the things you shouldn't do is what I call just so analyses, that you kind of play around with analyses enough to get the answer you want and then sort of present it as if that was the definitive way you want to do it. Again, you should define and have a clear idea of what you want to do ahead of time rather than filling things in after the fact. Those are things that aren't good for defending your analyses. All right, second main point here is that comparison. So first of all, when you're writing analyses, you should set up a basic model, sort of the simplest, most straightforward model. This is especially important for something like multiple regression, where you maybe have, you have your y variable, the variable you want to sort of predict. That is your response variable, and then you have your predictor variables or your x variables. But typically, you probably only have like one or two ones you really care about. So maybe like treatment when it comes to health outcome or something like that. And so you want to probably set up the basic model and run it so you understand what's going on at sort of the simplest modeling setup. Then from there, you probably want to build up to the full model. So it might look something like you have your Y variable, your most relevant X variable, your most relevant predictor variable, and then you add on, more variables, maybe, your confounders or other variables you think are important. So for example, I typically run for one of my analysis. We have the base variable, the one we really care about, and then we add on things like demographic variables because it's human subject research, and then maybe clinical variables, and then maybe other variables like environmental. So you build up to the full model, sort of checking it each time to make sure things make sense and that you're adding complexity in a way that's manageable. And then, yeah, compare models when appropriate, especially with multiple regression, maybe with a lot of variables. Maybe you're not sure if you should include certain variables when it comes to confounding, or you're not sure with interactions. So it might be appropriate to compare models, especially models that are submodels of other models using something like AIC scores, etc. It really would depend on your analyses. Now, for simpler analyses, you probably don't need this. But even with simpler models, say you're running a t-test, maybe you're not 100% sure if it meets all the normality, like requirements of the t-test, like normality. And so maybe you compare a parametric and a non-parametric test to make sure they're saying the same thing. So even if you have the weaker test, it's maybe still showing the results, or maybe it doesn't. And that might be a clear and honest comparison. And you might also consider sensitivity analyses, perhaps subsetting by only complete variables, maybe multiple imputation, maybe other sorts of relevant, well thought out ahead of time sensitivity analysis to make sure your results are really telling you what you're telling you think they're telling you, and not being thrown off by, say, maybe some strange variable or something like that. Now, on the flip side, again, there are some things that will not help you defend your analyses when it comes to comparison. The big one would be data mining and p-hacking. That is, you have a bunch of variables and you run things until you get significance and you call it good. And you say, oh, hey, this is what I got. Again, you should not be doing that. You should be thinking this out ahead of time and only including variables that are relevant or you think are relevant, based on literature, based on other things. Another related thing you shouldn't do is what I would call throwing analyses at the wall. So maybe you're not pulling out a subset or just checking a bunch of variables like p-hacking, but maybe you're doing analysis and then you do sub-analysis and you try all sorts of different analysis to try to get a result. Again, like throwing pasta at the wall and see what sticks, and then only presenting the stuff that sticks. Now, there's nothing against, as we saw here with comparisons, of running different analyses and reasonably presenting them. But what you want to avoid is just writing stuff and then only showing the stuff that worked, as if there wasn't a bunch of more complicated things and more nuanced realities to your data than you're actually presenting. All right, third one here is critique. That is kind of be your own worst critic. So you want to kill your darlings, or your darling hypothesis, as it were. As easy as it is, and as tempting as it is, and as human as it is to like want to protect and sort of coddle our hypothesis that you go into the research, is really the mark of good science is like actually trying to kill your hypothesis, try to disprove your hypothesis. And only after failing to disprove your hypothesis does it really have legs, does it really have some merit. And that's really hard. It's hard for even good scientists to do. But any way you can sort of develop that in your mindset of being a critic, critiquing your work, of trying to disprove your hypothesis rather than sort of coddle it and prove it, and keep it safe, will benefit your science and benefit in defending it if you're really harsh on your hypotheses. And related to that, you should really think through objections. should really think of like, okay, you did your analysis, you did the best you can. You think they're valid. Like, what sort of objections will people bring up? Don't sort of walk in there without having thought through what you think all the hardest, strongest objections are and having an answer for it. Even if the answer is we're not sure or that takes more work, like that's very even suggesting that yeah, those objections are valid is step in making a good defense. And yeah, you should really prepare more than you show. That is, you're going to put a lot of work into whatever the poster, the presentation, or even the paper, and you're only going to present sort of the main points, sort of the clear path, but you should of course be preparing much more than you show that. So then when objections do come up, you have the homework, you have the backing to do that. I mean, it's very common for competent scientists with their poster presentations to have a bunch of slides afterwards of supplementary information that didn't quite make it into the main thrust of the presentation, but if people bring it up, they can go to that and show them, yeah, no, we actually did that, or we consider that, and here's what we saw. And finally, it's always good to have what I call peer review before actual peer review. So going to your colleagues, going to your compatriots in the department to have them look over your paper to provide fairly friendly and collegial feedback before you go to, say, maybe submitting your article to a journal that the reviewers, the peer reviewers, don't know you, don't care about you, may be very harsh. It'd be good to have friendly support and clear up those issues before you go to a more hostile audience. All right, and then finally, some of the inverse things you shouldn't do. One would be strawman arguments of, instead of thinking of the hardest arguments and trying to respond to them, the thing you shouldn't do is just think of strawman, easily knocked over arguments for your objections to your paper, your work, or your science, and sort of have them ready to knock over. You should the opposite. What you should actually do is what I would call, what not I call, but what's called a steelman. You make the arguments as strong as possible. If you make them as weak as possible and knock over, that's not really helping defend your argument. You're again coddling your hypotheses. On the other side of thing is you should also not have complete skepticism. You should, if you did good work and you did good analysis, you thought through a lot of things, and you think your analyses, your scientific analyses are justifiable, you can be confident in that. You don't need to be a complete skeptic of like, yeah, I ran this, but I don't know if it's true or not, and who knows anything. You can have some certainty, you can have some confidence if you've done your work and if you've really bolstered your analyses, bolstered your arguments, and come in, well prepared. You don't need to be a complete skeptic. All right, with that, so what we covered here, these three ways to defend your scientific analysis. We looked at clarity, we looked at comparison, and we looked at critique. Hopefully these were helpful. And with that, I will end, and I will see you on the next short video.